All right, welcome everyone to this month's Research Ready Mentor Spotlight. We're very excited for today's topic on how site management of cancer trials have evolved during COVID. So for those of you who are less familiar with Research Ready and the Mentor Spotlight series, you can find more information on the CTO website. The Mentor Spotlight series is a monthly webinar series where an expert on a particular topic shares best practices and highlights exceptional processes relevant to the research community in Ontario and Canada. So we aim to be interactive in the live sessions, but we also make this available online on demand at the link below. We also have a certificate of attendance for anyone that's here today live. We just asked you to complete a very short survey that will pop up at the end of the session, and this will allow us to create the certificate for those who are collecting continuing education credits. We're also looking for any feedback you have or topics you'd like to see, and we welcome that feedback regardless of the certificate. So in terms of housekeeping, there will be some time at the end for questions. So feel free to ask them in the chat or raise your hand and we can address those at the end. And today we'd like to welcome Jill Beckley, who will be sharing her expertise with us. So Jill is a clinical research project manager who manages the leukemia, lymphoma, and histiocytosis portfolio of clinical trials in the CTSU at the Hospital for Sick Children. With 5 years of oncology experience, she is a C17 CRA Community of Practice co-chair and is an Ontario Cancer Research Ethics Board member. Her professional interests lie in innovative process development and building efficient, high-performing teams. Jill, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Emily. All right, let me just get my screen set up for everyone. Just let me know when you can see it and then we'll be ready to go.
That's perfect.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll hop right to it. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Emily. So as you all know, my name is Jill Beckley. I'm a clinical research newly minted program manager at the Hospital for Sick Children, where I guess that new title kind of comes in is that I'll be program manager for the education components, which makes a lot of sense because a lot of my research interests and general professional interests have to do with quality improvement initiatives and process improvement initiatives. So we do have a pretty packed agenda today, and so we'll be diving into how our site trial management practices have evolved due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And, you know, as mentioned in the tagline in the description, we'll be discussing some best practices for current processes, improving quality and efficiencies, and also how we've eliminated some silos between research and clinical groups at our site. For a lot of research coordinators prior to the pandemic, these roles have really traditionally required an on-site presence. Obviously, with COVID, that was no longer feasible, but really it was a unique opportunity, at least for us, to try out some new things. So I'll be sharing kind of what worked, what didn't, what we still use in our hybrid model, and what we're still building on. At the end of the day, with quality improvement, when it comes to research, it's always about doing research well. And you know, that's always the aim, but we want to be able to do it well, but we also want to be able to do it better. And we always want to know what we can do better. So first I'll sort of set the stage for you all. So I've been in trial management and oncology trial management for about 5 years, and every site that I've worked on has had vastly different setups. So this means that probably some of the issues that we face at our site might not necessarily apply to yours, but my hope is that you can see how we thought critically about these areas and maybe even apply that thinking to issues you may have at your site, even if they're different. And even if COVID hasn't totally changed or augmented how you manage your studies, there's been a lot of changes in the industry as well that COVID has also seen to accelerate. So in that same way that we consider COVID was an incubator for change at our site, it's also been an incubator for change on the industry side as well. So just some of those trends really quickly post-pandemic, where we're realizing a lot of our processes that we've changed has aligned with these industry trends as well. So we're seeing a rise in more decentralized trials, building on risk-based monitoring and activities that have to happen at a distance with less patient involvement at the site. Sponsors are now allocating their budgets very differently than they were before. We have way more virtual investigator meetings, site initiation visits, hosting remote monitoring visits as well. We've noticed in Ontario, at least in pediatric oncology, that Ontario has been opening studies, or the trials that have opened, big pharma ones, have chosen or selected fewer sites. So obviously that will have some downstream implications for the number of referrals and out-of-town patients that you receive as well. Personalized medicine has been on the rise for a number of years, but where it's really changed is our protocols, even consortium, where it almost identically mirrors our standard of care, have way more embedded sub-studies and have become more complex to kind of tease out what those mutations are and how they'll respond to treatment, with the aim being that we're much better able to stratify the risk groups. Surprisingly, throughout COVID as well, and at least at our site, we've had quite a number of single patient studies and rare patient population studies that have opened. And for a lot of patients that have been out of province. So though we had an excuse almost to implement and make these changes, streamlining these processes that we have implemented and streamlining them for efficiency means that you're able to operate at a much higher level. We found that we've been able to open more studies while maintaining the quality of work. So at the end of the day, if you're thinking about your process improvement and making those changes, always have it in mind that you're wanting it to be better so that you can take that on to the next project. So last, sort of as the breakdown and to kind of set the scene here, I wanted to give you all some insight into what we see at Sick Kids so that you know how many patients we see and what we deal with on a day-to-day basis in terms of the staffing that we have here and what our roles entail. So at Sick Kids, we see on average about 1 new diagnosis cancer patient every day. So that's around 365 patients. We have currently open in CTSU, we have 123 therapeutic studies that had opened in 2021. So these are non-biology banking studies. So these are studies with an active treatment component, consortium, and industry. Right now, we have about 397 patients active on treatment. This doesn't include the patients that we see in follow-up, and we still follow and complete data entry for follow-up. So it's crazy to think that that number is actually a lot higher. At Sick Kids, when patients are admitted, usually about 53% of patients will end up consenting to a therapeutic study. Now, with those biology studies where we're banking diagnostic samples, that number is actually much higher, and it's it's closer to 80. And a lot of biology banking studies will have to happen prior to the enrollment. So as you can probably surmise very easily, research is a heavily embedded component of the clinical care that our patients receive here. So this is just a quick little snippet of the division that I work in CTSU. So a couple pictures of us pre-pandemic, mid-pandemic, and closer to post-pandemic. But in CTSU, we facilitate consortium, investigator-initiated, and industry-sponsored clinical research studies within hematology oncology. And it's just about as close to a one-stop shop for activating and running trials as you can get. So there's about 30 of us, give or take. We're comprised of a research project assistants, some project coordinators, project managers, and program managers. We have a team of data managers in clinical informatics who help us program all of our protocols into Epic, which is our EMR. We have a contracts and budget specialist and a couple of research nurses that also help facilitate the research. Where our operations differ from other sites is that not all sections or pods, as we call them, have use or had use of a research nurse before COVID. So we do more than just data and regulatory aspects of the work. We ship specimens. We're confirming with the clinical areas what samples need to be drawn and when. We're administering questionnaires. For many studies as well, we will obtain consent in conjunction and in tandem with our clinical team. And then we review the clinical record for adverse events and make sure that they are appropriately logged so that our physicians can provide oversight. Down at the bottom there, we are a COG site, a member of the Children's Oncology Group. So we're one of 220 sites worldwide that put on these standard of care studies or piggyback closely off the standard of care. We are also the provincial applicant lead for the Ontario sites, primarily for our phase 2 and 3 studies. So this just very quickly, our pods follow the clinic structure with anywhere from 2 to 5 coordinators managing the entirety of each portfolio. Excuse me. All right. So into the meat and potatoes, I suppose, of our presentation here. COVID. So we'll be discussing pre to post, how the unprecedented became precedented. Of course, when COVID happened in March of 2020, there were a lot of areas of impact that changed in the hospital. But thinking about what primarily changed for us, not a whole lot. Our supportive care studies were paused to enrollment, but in terms of therapeutic studies, again, not a lot had changed. We were lucky that the pediatric oncology studies were considered absolutely essential. Monitoring still had to happen, although they had to be shifted to remote settings. And the changes that truly were that we couldn't have the same physical footprint on site to the same extent that we used to. So our approach pre-COVID was very hands-on. So our struggle really was how to ensure that same level of oversight. And part of that was really discovering that, and maybe not uncommonly so across sites, is that how siloed our research and clinical operations were. So what do I say what do I mean when I say that we realized our method of conducting research was very siloed? It goes beyond kind of just saying that coordinators do data entry, they identify patients, they do the monitoring visits, whereas the clinical team might provide medical oversight, because in research, there's always that level of communication there. There's always that level of overlap. And it's not even to be reductive to say that, we're pulling up a list and saying that the research team does so much more than the clinical team who also do research. But again, there's often so many components to one aspect of research. So I'm going to pull an example for us, and that's going to be consent and eligibility for the new diagnosis leukemia and lymphoma patients. So what that process actually looks like, on some days, it maybe feels like mayhem. So the silo that we were recognizing that was happening with the consent and enrollment is that less so that there's so many tasks where we're not communicating. It's that the clinical team needed to wait on the research team for a number of different tasks before completing any new key steps. So the silo and the downstream effects of that was that we were really disrupting the flow of a very busy inpatient ward. It meant that the clinical team's understanding of research was probably not as comprehensive as they thought it might have been, because they had no idea what we were doing on our end and sort of why things were taking so long. So obviously when this changed and when COVID started, we weren't there to be able we weren't there on the ward. So there was less waiting and more activity that the clinical team needed to take ownership of. So a couple things that they had to have was, again, familiarity with what the research process is beyond a blanket statement of consenting. So what does that mean? Do they know that they need to sign off on multiple pages of that consent form? When we're putting in orders to enroll a patient, do they know that they need to enter orders in a specific way? So a couple great things that kind of came out about this is that ownership there, we were no longer having to identify new diagnosis patients for them. They were coming to us. They contact us when there's a new admission. There's a central repository of consents that we oversee and we maintain instead of having to wait for a call every day to have a consent ready to kind of bring up. We flag the pages, we enter the spaces that need to be addressed, and all of our documentation is now moving to Epic. So instead of having to wait until there's a break in the day on the ward, which is never guaranteed, and having to do those enrollments and those consents right at the end, we were able to better stagger our day and then alleviate that burden on the clinical ward. So when we're removing silos, it's really about there's learning on both sides and there's a development of interdepartmental relationships, and but you're also fostering confidence in a lot of your team members. So it doesn't completely change or alter like the complexity of the task. So going from part A to B, if you think of it as a crazy, crazy winding road, the complexity is still there. It's just a smoother ride. It allows you to take a more direct path from point A to point B. But when your process is much leaner, you can now use that time to focus on other aspects that are part of your job, like study startup or sending out amendment training, reviewing your own workload on ASANA. So these two examples, the managing like your own day-to-day workload in ASANA and then the consenting process there are two examples I want you to remember because we'll go back to those. Next was sort of that incubation period of where we had to kind of figure out and determine, okay, where do we go from here and how do we actually implement these changes? So at this point, our site had already been using Epic. We had already been using Epic for about a year, but we definitely weren't using it to its full capacity. But because there were so many clinical areas that were impacted, we had to move very quickly and identify what our gaps were and where we needed to give some attention to. So we always had plans to kind of revitalize what our trial management process was, including Epic and those electronic processes. But the planned rollout would have been much, much smaller. And so much so that these workarounds that we needed to minimize on-site, so needing to minimize on-site presence, that is truly what became our standard practice, which doesn't necessarily happen all the time. But again, COVID really gave us the opportunity to test these out, implement things quickly where usually there might be a little bit of resistance. And it also allowed us to bypass sometimes like what can be probably difficult about process improvement and quality improvement is that there's shifting the culture of an understanding of how people do their work. So first things first is that we truly had to identify all the key areas where there were some gaps in our methods and that were not going to be possible with the institutional guidelines put in place in response to COVID-19. But we also noticed some trends across all kind of key components, AE and adverse events and ConMeds, medical oversight, so assessing labs, training and delegation, how we utilized wet ink signatures, eligibility and consent discussion documentation, which is the example I've highlighted, and then also sample collection. So what we noticed that there were a lot of instances of double documentation because a lot of things were already signed off in the medical chart by a delegated physician, but we were still asking them to stamp and sign things separately. So all of this sort of led to the adaptation of our existing solutions. So Epic, sometimes REDCap, in a lot of ways that, novel ways for our department instead of figuring out a workaround. I'm just gonna take a little water break because my voice is gone. All right. So probably the most exciting part, and what kind of makes me the most excited about this presentation, is how we rolled everything out. We were really excited to implement all of these. So figuring out how we rolled everything out, what worked and what didn't, is really kind of what gives me the greatest pride of, saying this is what we've done, and the downstream effects that those processes have had, including those relationships that we've built. So most of the time, and I've sort of learned this more as I've kind of moved forward in my career, that anything to do with quality improvement and culture shift, it's knowing that you need to gather data. You need to gather metrics in order to have a convincing argument. So it's one thing to identify your gap, but then you need to gather your metrics. The next that has been very key for us is a collaboration, and the collaboration and buy-in from all parties who potentially will be using this. When we're implementing a process, it's not just to make the research better. It's also got to make sense for very busy physicians, very busy nurses, who are helping us to facilitate the research and who will also need to be able to complete these tasks. So having a robust way to track your metrics, I first and foremost would definitely recommend. And it's the type of thing where, let's say for adverse event reporting, we had to change the way that we were having our physicians assess adverse events. And there was surprisingly a lot of resistance to doing it. So we used to meet monthly with our physicians, and they would review everything, and it would take quite a while. So even the shift of, something that might take them an extra minute as they're on a day-to-day basis would definitely save that whole hour. But without that data to say, this is how much we've billed for versus what this is the actual value of changing this process, it's much easier to make those kinds of decisions and to be convincing with your argument. And this is a very similar process to how we implemented all of our projects and pilots. So the next, again, to pilot, incredibly important that, we started small, schedule a review, and determine what your measures of success are going to be. How are you going to know something is actually working, or is it adding more to your plate? And then based on that, you might revise it after, you'll go back to collaborate, you'll go back to pilot, and you'll make those revisions based on the feedback that you have. So a couple things that I'll touch on today. I'll touch on EPIC a little bit more so than REDCap and ASANA, but I just wanted to make sure that you guys see how we've implemented these different resources in our day-to-day practice. So I'll start with EPIC, and going back to that example of consent and eligibility, this was one of the first processes that we moved fully to EPIC. So I'll show some examples, and I know that not all sites utilize EPIC and as their EMR. So if you use EPIC and would like to see the full scope of how we use it, including adverse events and con meds, I'll have my email at the end. So please contact me, and I'm happy to share all those. But I wanted to make sure that this presentation was obviously very inclusive of all different kinds of coordinators who are looking to revitalize their processes. So as a paper process that we had before, we would document the informed consent discussion process. So we were able to modify a worksheet within EPIC to kind of capture all of the same elements that we would have on our paper sign off. So this is something very easy for the physicians to hop into. So usually we'll help them with the version date of the consent, but they'll be able to tell us who they obtained consent from. There's also the option down there to add some comments, whether the patient has capacity to consent, confirmation that the family has had both ample time and opportunity to review the study, all questions were answered, and then it allows you to put in, based on your REB requirements, whether or not whoever explains the consent is the same person who obtains consent. We've also moved our eligibility discussion and our eligibility documentation to Epic as well. So what has been really key for us is to be able to template as much as possible, but to template with specificity. So if you've worked in research for a while, we all know that sometimes research common sense and clinical common sense are not the same thing. So items like confirming a patient has never received any cytotoxic chemo are things that, clinical common sense would say, if that's not in the baseline medical history, there's a good likelihood that that patient's never received chemo before. But for research, that's not the case. And they will require specific and explicit confirmation of this. So our templates allow us to be specific in this way to make sure that in the process of documenting everything, it's complete, it's thorough, and it's an accurate representation of the patient record. Once our consents are signed, one aspect that really involved extra time pre-EPIC was order entry. So prior to EPIC, we had paper requisitions that we needed wet ink signatures on, and we also needed to complete the entire requisition with all of this information here. So collecting 7 mils of bone marrow aspirate in a preservative-free heparinized syringe, because clearly we were not the people collecting those samples there. So on average for these new diagnosis leukemia patients, there can be upwards of 4 samples at that baseline diagnostic bone marrow aspirate. So this was tough for LNL patients because they go into procedures very quickly. We see most of our leukemia lymphoma patients through the eMERGE, and it's not uncommon that a patient will have their diagnosis and then start their treatment within 24 hours. So the timing on this window is very key, and so being able to eliminate that time was really important for us. So when the paper requisitions moved into EPIC, we were then shifting to manually entering each order, which probably actually took longer. But now order entry is now very speedy and it's accessible by both research and clinical teams. So we call these order sets and we are able to group them by protocol. So it's made the world of a difference to be able to just pop down that the study that you need to put in orders for. Automatically, it will put the correct date, you'll collect the right sample there, and then route it for signature. So most of the time, and this is what happens for our inpatient. So for the inpatient studies at diagnosis, this will happen in that inpatient setting. And then for the outpatient setting, it's more often that we have patients who are already enrolled. So we know they have a day 29 coming up. We know that they have assessments kind of further down the line. Having these orders means that we can kind of plan much more ahead. We can route them to the physicians ahead of time. We're not looking for signatures on the day of because they have to have that same date signature. And we've eliminated a fair amount of our deviations too, because the research orders can also be built into an EPIC protocol build. So within that therapeutic treatment plan, research samples are already embedded in there. So if we miss a sample collection nowadays, most of the time it's because there's inadequate sample, which you can't do anything about. So that's probably one of the best or easiest CAPAs to have. Flipping into the patient management from the research-only perspective in the non-clinical side, ASANA has been a key way that we've changed our processes. So this is an instance where patient management at the time occurred using like an Excel tracker, using an Outlook calendar. And we did this until we needed fewer people on site. Because when you have 3 or 4 coordinators who work very closely together, it's really easy to be in the know of what's happening because you have that face-to-face contact. Once COVID hit, we didn't have that anymore. And then because sometimes you'll have different enrollment aspects that might carry on over a couple days, we found that we just couldn't keep up with the amount of handover using those old methods. So we implemented ASANA, and it allowed us to see a very comprehensive list of the tasks coming up visually. But then it also allowed us to be able to delegate everything very efficiently to different team members depending on the days that we were coming in. And this was incredibly important for us because for some studies, like this study, AALL 1731, it's a study for standard risk leukemia lymphoma. So this is probably our highest accruing study in LNL with about 30 to 50 patients a year, and we follow them through treatment for about 2 years. So we expect that we will have over 160 patients total enrolled on this study. That's a lot of patients to have to follow and to be able to not miss any samples, cognitive studies, and whatnot. So it's a administratively heavy operation, I would say. I'll quickly go into RegCap and DocuSign just so that you know that we use it. But I think in the next couple slides, I really wanted to highlight some quality improvement projects that came about during COVID that really enhanced our relationship with the clinical team. So I'd prefer to focus on that, but I did want to share with you that we do use RegCap for amendment training now. So it allows us to keep track and obtain training documentation in a more timely manner. It also allows us to be able to send reminders, which is awesome because then we can follow up directly with physicians who have not done it. And they get that email. So sometimes and if it's something crazy urgent, we'll even set that reminder for 24 hours. We can be pretty ruthless with it. And then last but not least, DocuSign and Adobe Sign. So we started implementing DocuSign for all of our external facing documents, and then only resorting to wet ink signature unless we absolutely had to. And then Adobe Sign we use for all of our internal facing documents. So amendment assessments, so documents that wouldn't necessarily go off for a regulatory component. And then also important for us there was to update SOPs. So immediately as soon as you have a change, you should always be updating your SOPs to include that sort of language. So these are probably some of the greatest achievements that we've kind of had throughout COVID. And I really wanted to highlight some case studies of where we implemented some larger scale improvement projects that have enhanced our relationships with the hospital and the clinical team members who may facilitate research. They may be involved with research indirectly. They might not be delegated, but I think in the last 2 years, because of these projects, we've been able to operate at a much higher output. And again, knowing that there's been learning on both sides of research and the clinical teams, and developing these relationships has meant that we are way more confident in doing more of these difficult, intricate studies that are coming down the pipeline, where you have fewer control over processes that are supposed to occur more remotely now, because we have that groundwork in place. It's truly been something very special. So first is our fellows involvement. So I know some institutions may delegate their fellows. At SickKids, we do not. So they're not delegated for our new diagnosis biobanking or our COG treatment studies. But as part of a clinical process, they're overseen by the physicians there. So the daily progress notes while the patients are admitted to the ward, an issue that we were having was that these notes were not being co-signed. So in research, as you know, if your note is not co-signed, then you need some kind of acknowledgement that a delegated person has reviewed it and has taken that into consideration whether or not the patient proceeds with treatment the next day. So we had a fair number of increased deviations related to this. it ended up being quite a stress on the clinical and research team, and we figured that, there was a lot of hand-holding going on. Fellows were not that sure of like what they could or what they couldn't do. So what we ended up doing is that we now teach at their new ACADU Fellows Orientation Day. We represent at their academic half days, and we've created some resources that are readily available, so infographics for quick reference, so that they know what they can or can't do. So even though they might only be in L&L for a short amount of time, they feel confident in knowing what they need to do, that their focus can be strictly on the clinical components and less so about having to help make research happen when they're not necessarily directly involved in that research. The next process that we worked quite hard on was our Cujo. So Cujo's is the name of our procedure room, and if you are a fan of hockey, then you know who Cujo is. And yes, the room is painted with entirely hockey themed. So it's a very interesting room to be in, given that a lot of lumbar punctures happen in that room. So the issues that we were having was that we had opened a plethora of studies that all had similar research samples to obtain, but yet they were all kind of different. So they may have been the same specimen, but maybe they need to go into different tubes. So the Cujo's operators, the nurses, physicians, and the trainees in there were unsure of the required samples given the vast number of them. So we were constantly double checking and on standby. And it's tough to be on standby when, they're in procedure room is open for 7 to 8 hours a day. And then sometimes as well, it was tricky because people who had experience one day that this is how we followed, if they tried to apply a pattern to it, it didn't always work because the next day the samples were different. The patient, although similar, is different. And so we were just racking up a ton of deviations. So we worked with the operators and some of the fellows to create a flow sheet that truly followed what happens from consent through to the sample collection. Because again, a lot of these patients, when they're going for their diagnostic samples, that has its own case of upwards of 5 to 15 different samples. So to add on an extra 4 samples just for research just adds a lot of work burden. So they still use this up in there, and I think we usually just get called about pickup now, which is great because then it just optimizes our time. And then last but not least, so the relationships that we've developed with the nurse practitioners and contact nurses. So the background for this project was we had an audit finding that our take-home medication compliance and that documentation was not adequate, and especially for those standard of care drugs. I think the tricky part about standard of care studies sometimes is that because we do it clinically, we will follow a clinical process, but because it's technically still a regulated clinical trial, it then becomes very hard to implement a research specific process, especially for the documentation where, you only are doing it differently because the patient is a research patient. So initially we do have a template for the take home medications, and on my next slide, I show you kind of what we did before and what it looks like after. So this pilot project, we were working directly with the NPs and contact nurses who are the ones who do confirm missed doses with the patient. So we didn't want to disrupt what their clinical process was, absolutely. But for them to be able to clinically verify the compliance, adding in those extra elements to make sure that we're also research compliant was where that gap sort of lay. So we created, again, another infographic with a step-by-step of how they change those EPIC notes. So it took us from the image on the left, which is the old way of how outpatient medications were documented in EMR. So you can see at the bottom in yellow, I confirm that the patient's standard of care medication history was reviewed with the patient and caregiver as noted above. that was not research compliant because there's no start date, there's no end date, there's no documentation that there's any missed doses. So from this pilot project, we now, underneath the dexamethasone 1 milligram per milliliters suspension, we now have a new column that has last dose for what we're taking and we're not taking. There's that information there that says no missed doses. And then we've changed that language at the bottom that says, unless noted above, the patient and or caregiver report that all medications have been taken as prescribed and that there have been no missed doses. So alluding back and thinking back to, when you have projects like this that require a pretty heavy culture shift, those last 3 steps, the revisions, the buy-in, the collaboration, this is what is going to build those better relationships with the internal departments. Once you have more people invested in doing it right and invested in making that change, it becomes smooth sailing after the fact. So there's no issue with having to repeat those kind of last 3 until you've determined the best process that works for you. And, even some of the processes that we've implemented here might also just not work or might not be feasible at your site, but it's always good. It's always good to think about it. So now that the pandemic is over, fingers, knees, and toes crossed, we've got these new processes in place. So where are we and sort of what's next, and how do we know if things are objectively better and how are things quantitatively better? And again, we use data and we use metrics. So for us, what was really important was that we were hoping to have fewer drafted CAPAs and deviations. So that we have definitely achieved. And we've found that we've logged fewer deviations, particularly in response to monitoring visits that we've had, but also the audits that we've had over the last 3 years as well. We are a part of 3CTN, so for their high priority studies, there's some incentive funding to be able to complete your study startup within the 90 days. So since we've optimized a lot of these processes and the research process feels a lot less like an all hands on deck every single time a patient comes in, this means that our resources have been better allocated to activating studies in a timely manner and hitting that target 90-day. There's nothing better than being able to open the study and, to do our best to make sure that we're not running into the red and not operating at a deficit. Across our audit preparation this year, particularly for our COG audits, and to some extent our Health Canada audit that we had last year, the preparation has felt a lot more seamless, especially with a fewer number of findings related to the documentation. There have been a few lessons learned, though, as to be expected. We've been calling it epic note bloat. So each visit that a patient has with multiple providers, there's an image kind of down there. Those are all notes for the exact same visit. So sometimes it can be quite difficult to find the information that you are looking for, which has sometimes been a problem for auditors and from auditors coming to the site. We're still finding some hiccups with consistent use of our take-home medication documentation, and it's still a work in progress. And we'll have some more refinement to do after this year's COG audit, particularly asking for an end date on those medications as well. We've noticed with some of our templates, sometimes the small errors can have a big downstream effect. So as part of our audit preparation, we spent a good chunk of time booking appointments with the physicians to make addendums to these. So they were all very gracious, and at the end of the day, it maybe only took about like 15 or 20, but we've added in second checks from other CRAs before we fully implement a template, just to make sure that it is correct. It's got the right amount of information. And then last but not least, another facet of our research process here at Sick Kids, we realized our checklists for new hires were maybe not as comprehensive as we thought they were. So we've also spent a good deal of time updating it so that when the clinical team therefore has questions, we know our processes very well, so that they can feel confident in the answers that they're giving to the clinical team, as well as being confident in what they're doing themselves. I will leave on some best practices. So research builds and improves on critical thinking. I think at the core, that is true through and through. So small things that you may do for yourself to keep organized, let's say using an Excel tracker. Think of what can be scalable from an Excel sheet to then using software. So if your institution involves roles that are more clearly defined, so let's say you only do data and regulatory work, and you're looking for ways to be involved with process improvement, maybe this is an opportunity to refine how the training happens, or if you have any tips or tricks, what can you therefore share with other newer coordinators who may be able to benefit from it. So I think that always research is always a buildable process. And then in the same way, process improvement is always a buildable process. Again, and I will reiterate this until the day that I die, data is your best friend. It's so key for being persuasive in your communication. The next, and maybe this seems like a no-brainer, but listening effectively. So when there's resistance and hesitation to change, it's likely that someone doesn't know why your why is important. So they don't understand why this process is important. So take it as an opportunity to listen and then be able to compile and address those concerns that they have. And then last but not least, update your SOPs as soon as you implement your practices. It's good to keep them general, to include electronic processes in case software becomes obsolete, but then that way you're covered from a regulatory standpoint in case you have any surprise inspections. So without further ado, I'd love to be able to open up to any questions you might have.
Thanks, Jill. That was a great presentation. So at this time, if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or to raise your hand and unmute yourselves. We do have some time, so we can go through those. And then as Jill mentioned as well, if you have any specific questions on Epic, if your site is implementing it, there's Jill's contact information. So she's happy to answer some questions or share some more detailed slides on that.
Oh, we do have a question. So what metrics would you suggest to start with if the site was just getting into this? So sometimes maybe that might depend on how you're tracking your time. If you have to do time tracking as part of your compensation to be able to say what you've kind of spent your time on. But if you've been noticing that, something small just seems to always take you a little bit longer, or if something kind of feels like it's bumpy every single time you do it and you complete that task, then I think that would be a good place to start to kind of figure out what metrics you might want to be looking at and what kind of data. So whether that be time spent, if things are continuously late. So I would probably start there.
And Jill, you mentioned that you have gone through some audits and that these processes have made it more seamless. Are you working on implementing anything else to help streamline future audits? Anything that you learned from those ones?
Yeah, for sure. So we recently had an audit where it came into question our consenting process. So even though we follow our guidelines pretty well, there were a lot of small errors to be made. And you know, even though it seems kind of silly, good documentation practice. And in the heat of the moment, when things are going and moving very fast on that clinic floor, it's very easy to kind of miss those steps. So even though we document it in our informed consent discussion, let's say if a parent has signed on the wrong line and they've crossed it out and they've not initialed and dated those types of things, our next plan for right now, or our next like major process improvement project, I guess, we'll be implementing is sort of a consent overview checklist, so that when the CRA receives or a coordinator receives that informed consent checklist, or when they receive the consent, sorry, they're following a consent checklist to be able to flag and to look for in case there's any missing pages. Especially as these consents seem to get longer and longer for these therapeutic studies with all of these optional embedded studies. It's very easy to just flip to the back page, sign it, and be done with it without really realizing that, you know, there might be 2 or 3 other pages in the middle of the consent form that outline a sub-study. So a lot of corrective action kind of had to go there. So that's sort of our next big process there.
That's great. Looks like we have one more question that came through. So if you could speak on a bit more on why remote monitoring is more time consuming than face-to-face.
Yeah, so that is a great question. So getting a monitor set up in process is not as difficult, but we're finding that you know, initially at the very beginning of the pandemic, the options were, before we were able to grant access to our EMR, we would have to do things like screen sharing, which therefore, you know, when a monitor is on site and they're familiar with the EMR system, they can go in and check, and then you can have an hour at the end of the day to kind of go over any of the findings that they have. More time consuming for us, for sure, is when we need to be able to screen share those documents with them, or aspects of the patient chart. Another part that we find with Epic is that the view that we see is not consistent with the view that the monitors see. So it takes a lot of time, even if we have to go and be able to help them, for us to be able to find the same documentation on a completely different interface has been really challenging as well. And so we have been billing a fair amount like for that time, and is definitely something that's provided an unexpected challenge, because you assume that remote, well, they're not here, so it won't be too much extra work.
Great. If anyone else has any other questions before we wrap up, feel free to unmute yourself or enter it in the chat. Okay, well, Jill, that was a great and informative presentation. So thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who attended as well. As a reminder, the survey will pop up on your screen at the end of the meeting. Just a few questions if you'd like to receive a certificate of attendance or provide any feedback to us. You can fill that out. And we hope to see you all at our next Mentor Spotlight session, which will be on June 28th on clinical trial agreements. So thank you all. Thanks again, Jill. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.